Hello, team. It's me, Jimmy. Are you free now?
Alright, we have your results here.
Wait, can I get it printed out?
We are an anonymous test clinic, so we don't print out your results for you, but you can get one done in a private clinic.
What's this?
HIV and AIDS has been an issue, a serious issue, since it was discovered in India in 1986. Now we realize that the issues surrounding do not just affect the high-risk groups like migrant workers, truck drivers, commercial sex workers, but through bridge communities, it has entered our families, it has entered our homes. What we want to do is to introduce HIV and AIDS in a way everybody can understand, and then look at some of the issues involved. I'd like to introduce you to HIV and AIDS. What is AIDS? What is HIV? Is there a difference? Let's start. What does HIV stand for? Human immunodeficiency virus. And what does AIDS stand for? Acquired human immunodeficiency syndrome. Are they the same thing? Is there a difference? Does the HIV virus have to become part of the AIDS syndrome? The answer is no. From the moment one is infected with the HIV virus, one is known to be HIV positive. This may lead to that person eventually having AIDS, but not necessarily. HIV and AIDS are two separate stages. If an HIV positive person stops all kinds of risky behavior, that means having multiple sexual partners, injecting oneself with drugs, and if that person gets support from home, from society, from religious leaders, has healthy, nutritious food, and takes their ART medication regularly, they can lead healthy, dignified, productive lives just like you and me. So how does the virus get transmitted? And how does a person get infected? The HIV virus travels through some human body fluids which are more infectious than others. For example, human blood, which includes menstrual blood, semen, vaginal fluids or secretions, and breast milk. But there are some other fluids which are less infectious. I would say saliva, tears, sweat, feces or stool, urine. There's less chances of the virus passing through these. One thing is very clear. HIV is not spread by eating from a common plate, drinking from a common cup, sitting on common toilet seats, from mosquito bites, shaking hands, touching, hugging, through swimming pools. You know, you can live and work with an HIV positive person for years without contracting the virus. There are only 4 ways you can contract the virus and become HIV positive. 1, by having unprotected sex with an HIV infected partner. 2, by transfusion of infected blood. 3, by using an HIV infected syringe or needle. And 4, from an HIV infected mother to her child. Let's take a look at each of these separately. First, by having unprotected sex with an HIV infected person. 80 to 85% of HIV transmission all over the world, except in certain pockets, the virus passes through this sexual route. By deep kissing, a light kiss on the cheek or the mouth may be considered safe, but deep kissing inside the mouth is not safe. Tiny, invisible lacerations or cuts in either person's mouth can pass the virus. Similarly, oral sex, for the same reason, oral sex is not safe. And anal sex is definitely not safe because the membranes and tissues in the anus are much softer and more sensitive than the vagina and can tear easily, thus passing the virus. So how do we prevent this? How can one avoid HIV and AIDS being transmitted through this sexual route? The traditional preventive methods brought up by the government of India, the United Nations, was called the ABC method. What is the ABC method? A, abstain from sex till you're married. Delay your sexual debut, that's what it means. B stands for be faithful to your wife or to your life partner. And what about C? Well, C says if you cannot either do A or B, that is abstain or be faithful, then C, use a condom. But we must be very clear. Government advertisements, United Nations, all of them highlight use of the condom. But faith leaders, religious leaders all over the world prefer to highlight abstinence and faithfulness and virtue as the only 100% guarantees. The International Network of Religious Leaders Living with HIV and AIDS, it's called Inarella Positive, prefers SAVE to ABC, S-A-V-E. And what is SAVE? S stands for safer practices, covering all the different modes of transmission, whether it be blood transfusions, the use of condoms, or sterile needles for injecting. And A stands for access to treatment. That means not just antiretroviral therapy, but treatment for HIV-related infections and the provision of good nutrition, particularly to help adherence to the ART regulation. What about V? V stands for voluntary testing and disclosure. Basically, it works on this premise. If you know you are positive, you can protect yourself and others. And if you know you are HIV negative, you can take the necessary steps to remain that way. So that's V, voluntary testing and disclosure. And E stands for empowerment. This talks about empowerment through education and advocacy. According to Inarella, stigma, shame, denial, discrimination, inaction, and the misaction associated with HIV remains today a massive challenge to people's uptake of services associated with HIV, and also to people living with HIV and AIDS. Let's go to the second of the 4 ways you can become HIV positive: by transfusion of HIV-infected blood. The problem is many blood banks do not have a tried and tested method to test blood for HIV. So when you go to a bank, you have no guarantees of the quality of blood you're getting. Even when you take people with you to donate blood for you, what the banks does is to store that blood and give you blood which is someone else's. And this could be infected blood. There's only one way of prevention: obtain blood from a blood bank or a hospital which has a good reputation and a safe testing method. There is no other way. The third way of getting HIV is by using an HIV-infected syringe or needle. In rural health settings, in villages, the same syringe or needle is often used for several patients. Often sterilization methods are not safe. In cities and urban settings, hospitals and doctors are still not using disposable syringes, perhaps because of the high cost. Intravenous drug users, known as IVDUs, are on the high risk category because this is a very common way of passing HIV. How can we prevent HIV through infected syringes? If we ensure safe sterilization of the syringe when you take an injection, that could be one. If not, ensure the use of disposable syringes. Then you are certain about this. The fourth way one can become HIV positive is to get infection from an HIV infected mother to her child. The chances of an HIV positive mother giving birth to an HIV positive child is 33%. But there's good news. With the right medicine given to mother and the child at the right time, this risk can be reduced down to 3 to 5%. There is no cure yet for HIV and AIDS, but there are medicines and drugs which can allow a positive person to live a full and dignified life. These medicines are called ARTs, antiretroviral therapy. So how does one test for HIV? How does one know one is infected? What tests are to be done? Let's look at some of the symptoms that show up. There's prolonged, unexplained fatigue, fever lasting 10 days or more, frequent, long-lasting diarrhea, skin rashes, mouth lesions, ulcers, swollen lymph glands in the armpit or the groin, and in unintentional rapid weight loss. These are all symptoms of HIV. And when one feels one needs to be tested, there are two tests. One is for those who are coming in first time and they screen out the negatives. It's called the rapid spot test, or a second test is called the ELISA, which is an enzyme-linked immunosorbent assay. Once this is done, you need to confirm it with a secondary group of tests. So you take a second ELISA and a second Western blot. Government hospitals give these tests for free, but they must follow certain principles. The principles of HIV testing are: you must protect the confidentiality of the person who's being tested. You cannot test someone and then publicize the results. You need to obtain informed consent before testing. So the test should be voluntary and without any coercion whatsoever. And when one goes for a test, there's something called a pre-test and a post-test counseling that is essential. One part of this is known as the window period. A person who goes in for some kind of high-risk behavior and immediately goes for a test may show negative results, because the window period is for about 3 to 6 months after that risky behavior. During this period, you may actually have contracted the virus, but your body will not test positive. To be absolutely sure, test yourself again after 6 months after risky behavior. Remember, one never dies of HIV or of AIDS, but one can die of opportunistic infections, they're called OIs, that affect people living with HIV and AIDS. I'll give you some names of some OIs: herpes zoster, tuberculosis, oral candidiosis, and cryptosporidiosis. Many HIV positive or people living with AIDS die of tuberculosis. Nobody says they die of AIDS. One has no immunity. So when these opportunistic infections enter the body, the infection debilitates the body, and that's how one dies. Let's talk about stigma and discrimination. Many HIV positive people lose hope when society shuns them.
And it is very painful experience for me in a life, not being HIV positive. But if my faith is treating me like this, I'm very sorry. I can fight HIV very easily, but not with stigma and discrimination.
What should be your response to those who are HIV infected? Are you biased against them? Do you stigmatize them? They need your support, not your judgment, nor your discrimination. I'd like you to look at stigma and discrimination in two ways. Stigma refers to the unfavorable attitudes and beliefs directed towards someone or something. It reflects an attitude, in this case, towards people who are HIV positive. Discrimination, on the other hand, is the treatment of an individual or group with partiality or prejudice. It's an act or a behavior. How do we behave towards people who are HIV positive? The main causes of stigma include insufficient knowledge. We have many myths and fears about how HIV is transmitted. It also concerns the life potential of a person living with HIV. We've already decided if someone is positive, they have a lesser life potential. And then we make moral judgments about people as we assume how they've been infected with HIV. We have fears about linking this disease with death. And then there's the social and cultural pressures that come on all of us. And at the moment, society is weighed heavily against positive people. There is no doubt. Stigma breeds discrimination. Stigma kills. Stigma destroys human lives. Can we agree on something? AIDS is a disease like any other. It is not a moral issue. So let's stop stigmatizing and discriminating against people living with HIV and AIDS. I would like to highlight two areas of stigma. Stigma against women who are HIV positive. See, women are biologically more susceptible to this virus, being the recipient partner. Most HIV positive women have been known to be faithful to their husbands who have infected them. Daughters-in-law are often thrown out of their homes when found to be HIV positive, though it's the husband who actually infected them. And this is a fact, that stigma against a woman with HIV is greater than an HIV positive man. We have stigma in our language, and I'm sure we can use more appropriate terms. So many people talk about, he is an AIDS sufferer, she is an AIDS patient. Many people who are HIV positive are not suffering. They are not patients. Refer to them as HIV positive persons or PLWAs, persons living with HIV or AIDS. And then there's that loaded term, prostitute. Today, we prefer to use the word CSW or commercial sex worker. And the old word homosexual, the newer word gay. Especially men prefer to be known as MSMs or men who have sex with men. And should a person be using drugs, we say he is a drug user, she is a drug addict. They are IVDUs. They use drugs. So we call them intravenous drug users. I'd like to take you through some recent trends and tendencies in HIV and AIDS. First of all, the pharmaceutical companies. The pharmaceutical companies like Cipla and other pharmaceutical companies took advantage of the process patent laws. Then they exported to Africa and other developing countries these drugs, especially for HIV, at a much cheaper rate than Western countries would sell them. Novartis is one of the companies that went to court against Cipla. And the good news is, in January of 2013, the Supreme Court ruled against Novartis. And now pharmaceutical companies can manufacture these so-called patented drugs. The second here I'd like to talk about is microbicides and vaccinations. Imagine you have a vaccination that if you take at your childhood, forever it prevents HIV. Unfortunately, though trials are going on, no company has been successful in bringing out an acceptable prototype. If successful, these could have cut new infection rates by as much as 60%. But a final solution is still 5 years away. The third thing I'd like to talk about are the networks of HIV positive people. HIV positive people living with HIV, had a problem. They were ostracized, they were stigmatized. So they came together in national and international networks that now exist in many countries around the world. For example, the Global Network for Positive People, known as GNP+, and the Indian Network of Positive People, the INP+, and then the International Network of Religious Leaders living with HIV and AIDS, called Innerella+. Many such networks exist. These networks intend to make positive people self-reliant, to be involved with decision making in all matters that affect them. And they insist on what is called the GIPA principle, GIPA, the greater involvement of people living with HIV and AIDS. They say, don't talk about us without us. And I think that's right. The fourth area I'd like to talk about are interfaith responses to the AIDS virus. Not one religion has to worry about HIV. It is a matter that affects all religions. And so many countries have got together interfaith platforms to talk about how to respond through religious ways, through scriptures, through sermons, through liturgies, to respond to the AIDS virus. Long ago, the South Asian Interreligious Council was created in Kathmandu in 2003. In 2005, the Asian Interfaith Network on AIDS was started in Thailand. The India Interfaith Coalition on HIV was started in 2006. Many other Asian countries today respond to them. Many of them come together, especially at the time of the International Congress on AIDS in the Asia Pacific, called ICAP. I'd like to talk about some international conferences that took place all over the world, where AIDS became a focal point and everything around AIDS has been discussed. We're talking about Vienna in 2010, we're talking about Busan, Korea in 2011, the Washington DC International AIDS Conference in July 2012, and the most recent ICAP 11 held in Bangkok in November of 2013. In 2014, we have the International AIDS Conference scheduled in Melbourne in Australia, and we have the International Congress on Asia Pacific AIDS in Dhaka, Bangladesh in August 2015. All of these international conferences highlight not just HIV and AIDS, but the latest scientific breakthroughs, the latest in areas which touch the lives of positive people. But almost 20 years later, we have gone beyond the knowledge and awareness of HIV and AIDS. But the real challenge is to go beyond the stigma and discrimination that affects this virus, and not just this virus and positive people, but other communities of marginalized and discriminated people, like the Dalits, like women, like mentally challenged people, the LGBT community consisting of lesbians, gays, transgenders. We need to bring in an era of care and support, where human beings look after one another, and so we work towards a better world.